7. We'll wrap up our discussion of ed policy today by following the money. Certainly one of the most important aspects of any institution and any government agency is how it's funded and how funding politically takes place, but also what the impact of that funding is. And so we're going to take a look quickly at a few major concepts in the role of money in public education. One of the big challenges you can see from this cartoon is the issue of that have been felt by school districts and teachers all around the country is the ever increasing raising the bar, as you can see in this analogy of the high jump or the pole vault, with at the same time smaller amounts of resources, in this case a shorter stick from which to do the pole vault to a higher bar. So in this context, we want to start with a very quick look again at the theoretical, philosophical, and historical context. We talked about the pedagogical progressives versus the administrative progressives, Dewey and Thorndike, the pedagogy ideas versus testing and efficiency, the one best system based on management principles, the Taylorist model. That wins the day, and as a result, school districts are established and set up using management principles, and the funding then becomes, and the whole organization becomes an exercise in Taylorism and management in the same sense that occur in the private sector. You compound this with sort of the discussion that we've already taken a look at in federalism, and that's the local control and implementation that occurs through local school organizations, boards of education, LEAs, but for the most part state-run. The states are really wielding more influence, power, and money, and federal oversight, particularly since 1965 around equity. And so if you look at the historical view of things, the 19th and early 20th century, 80% of the funding, again, following the money, was local, 20% was the state, and only a very, very minor fraction federal. By the mid-20th century into the 21st century, the state's role, as far as the money is concerned, increases to between 45 and 55%. The local share diminishes significantly, cut in half, between 40 and 45%. And the federal role plays, depending on the district and the kind of population, somewhere in the 8 to 10% range. And so in looking at the money that way, one of the big trends that we will look at in the case that you're reading that I did, as well as some of the other cases that we've looked at, really focus on equity and adequacy. This really comes about because, for the most part, the federal government punts. This notion that you have different funding mechanisms for as many kind of districts and different levels of spending and different levels of wealth, particularly as taxes are tied to wealth and property values. But the U.S. Supreme Court never weighed in. Two cases, Serrano v. Priest and Rodriguez versus San Antonio Independent, indicate that equity of spending is not required per the U.S. Constitution. And the Rodriguez case really spurred the fact that the court said it was not a federal function, really spurred the equity and adequacy arguments to the state level. And so suits began to be filed in state courts all around the country. And of course, one of the bellwether decisions was here in Kentucky, the Rose decision in 1989, which of course declared our funding mechanism in the entire education system unconstitutional, set up the CARA reform and the funding model that we use in Kentucky schools. There are lots of other examples of states that go through the same equity model as Kentucky did. We used in the case study Kansas as a more recent example to compare one of the early and one later looks at the adequacy and equity debate. And so the courts have really struggled to define how to do this, how to define equitable and adequate spending for education. Education finance really is one of those interesting topics to study from an economics perspective, and economists all have theories and their own language, it seems. And in the economics that we're talking about with schools, there's Baumol's theory of rising costs, and this is the iron law of increasing costs, that costs always rise in the education industry because the industry really can't enjoy the same kind of productivity gains that industries like manufacturing and farming have been able to enjoy based on technology. They've been able to reduce costs mostly through labor, and education productivity is really less productive today than it was 50 or 60 years ago. And so in 1960, there were 6 workers per 100 students. In 2005, 12 workers per 100 students. In 1920, the average cost to educate a student was about $1,000 a student, and that was a 1% as percentage of the gross domestic product at the time. In 2014, the average cost adjusted for inflation was $12,000 to educate a student. And again, that jumps from 1% to 5.4% as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the overall measure of the economy. And so we're spending more money in education, a lot more money in education. And one of the fundamental arguments is, what is the return? And that really is what prompted a lot of the reforms beginning with the nation at risk. But if you just take a look at some of the historical data here, you can see per pupil expenditures from 1920 to 2010 and the jump. You can see the overall revenues in education going from less than $1 billion to almost a $600 billion industry. And you can see the share of funding that we already related in more general terms, but you can see how it jumps from 1920 to 2010, where the federal government's role increases to about 10%. The state role decreases, um, and the state role also increases, and it increases significantly. And the local role decreases from about 80% to less than 50%. So that's a major story to tell as far as the historical funding of schools. And if you look at this as it relates to the overall economy, as we sort of mentioned, in 1930, you had it was a $2.1 billion industry, which ended up being about 2% of the GDP and about 2.5% of personal income, average personal income in our country. And it begins to grow. It really begins to balloon after the federal programs are put in place in the 1960s, but then it really escalates, it doubles after a nation at risk. You begin to see this notion of throwing more money to try to help improve the process of education. And so it's a $600 billion industry that is taking up about 5% of the GDP and about 5% of personal income. So that's a significant change. Where is the money going? A lot of the money is going to instruction. And you can see, obviously, 85% of most budgets, 80 to 85, are in staff. And you can see from 1960 to 2008 where the staffing has changed. And you can see district administrations actually go down, as do school administration. So there's a misnomer that the money is being spent on administrative support, and that really is not true. And it's also not being spent to the same degree that it is on teachers, because teachers are a smaller percentage of the overall education workforce in 2008 than they were in 1960. A lot of the money is going for teachers' aides, so it's an attempt at a cheaper alternative. Again, looking at productivity and Baumol's theory, rather than ballooning the teacher workforce, you're cutting a little bit of the teacher workforce and looking for a lower skilled version that can work with the teacher. Again, a very good piece of evidence for a career ladder type of approach to be used in education. You can see counselors also grew, and support staff Modest growth. So operations are not occupying a lot of the budget. It's mostly growth in instruction. It's mostly growth in ways to support instruction. So it begs the question, does money matter? And research shows that it does, but not in isolation. Just throwing money at the issue is not the significant issue, as with the reading from Eric Hanchuet from Harvard. It's how the money's spent that really matters the most. It's not the money, it's how it's spent. So it's really a combination of money being well funded, but also making sure that it's being deployed appropriately. And so, it's being provided in both unequal ways and insufficient amounts to assess the degree of equity and adequacy in certain finance systems around the country. There are more effective ways to use resources for maximum impact. The question is, how do you do that with staffing, with a cohesive strategy, and with the teacher workforce, and how you effectively um, work with the teacher workforce, something we talked a bit about already when we talked about teacher effectiveness. And obviously, teachers are the top commodity. We've already established these studies that the value of a teacher is about 12 to 17% in standard deviation increase. Um, again, we talked about the statistical insignificance of degrees and certification, and that pay has risen, but not as much as other college degree holders, factoring in 9-month contracts and benefits. It's a little more even, but still, there's a lot of options out there for people that get degrees. And obviously, many of them are not choosing the teaching ranks these days. So, the question does beg how we pay teachers. Benefits and pay right now really skews toward longevity, and the research, as we looked at, does not really support that longevity because student achievement tends to decline as a teacher stays in isolation in the classroom over the long haul. So it does beg the question of how we look at paying teachers and how we look at a system to where you have um, the right approach to using this type of incentive. So the question really is pay for experience. Teachers reach the high water mark about year 10, some of them closer to year 15. Um, and you look at these ideas like market pay, battle pay, merit pay, and value added measures that are all very controversial and things that we've already discussed some. Um, Class size reduction is another major thing. And there's a lot of new research coming out that might contradict some of this. So I'll say that out front. But for the most part, most of the studies on class size reduction seem to indicate that unless you really cut class size, you're not really getting the bang for the buck. The bang for the buck, the conclusion of most educational experts is that it's not an effective way to spend education dollars. The most effective allocation of education dollars is basically to pay teachers a competitive salary and to hire the most effective teachers. Investment in teacher pay and compensation is worth the dollars. If you look at this whole notion of where the dollars are going and how effective they are, you're seeing increased education spending, particularly on instruction. The question is whether it's instructional staff or non-instructional staff. As I said, much of those dollars are going to aides and non-instructional or people that are not trained to be instructional in the same way or have the experience of being instructional. Changes in patterns of resource, sometimes the way these are categorized creates a problem. Um, but a lot of the money is also being spent in non-core subjects. So you have additional electives, addition of career and tech education programs, addition of special education services. That accounted for a very large increase in educational revenues and the spending in education because since the 1970s, we spend a lot of money there that hadn't been spent before. So the portion of increased revenue spent on teacher salary has also gone up, but not as drastically perhaps as it needs to. So the bottom line is since educational resources have grown at a faster pace than educational achievement, there's a lot of scrutiny, and that's really where a lot of the accountability measures came in, is all the money being thrown at the education industry without seeing major improvements in educational achievement, especially when you look at gaps for poverty and inequality. So, despite the expansion of resources for special needs students, which represents a worthwhile investment, research has shown pull-out programs, extra services are not a productive use of funds, and yet there's a lot of funds being used for that. And so, again, teachers have the greatest impact. Spending on teacher compensation is the largest expenditures in most districts, and trying to figure out a way to compensate teachers and look at different ways to compensate teachers rather than the single salary schedule model that most school districts use. Um, very few elements of this system are tied to the core goals and outcomes that we're looking at, and that's a major issue. Despite this, most initiatives to reform the system haven't been successful, mainly because of unions and because of tenure laws. And this slide and some of the following slides we've already looked at when it comes to looking at teacher effectiveness, ways that we can redesign it, and ways to continue, whoops, wrong direction, but also redesign teacher pay, and the Odin and Pickus schedule that's really tied to many of the career pathway models is a good example of that. So as we wrap up here, we want to look at ways that districts can continue to look strategically at budgeting, focusing on core instruction and foundational curriculum, recruiting and retaining effective teachers, and time available for teachers to be collaborative. School districts should resist the pressure to continually add more electives away from the core subjects. Obviously, this is a challenge because of career tech education. Again, the research is very mixed on doing that. And so it's very, very definitely an item for debate and discussion. And I want to close by looking at tax issues, two approaches to tax, because one of the fundamental pieces, since states are the prime funders of education, state tax policy becomes probably the most important guiding policy decision for education funding. And so, in this neoliberal environment, Kansas is the state that decided to use the focus on tax cuts, the focus on that neoliberal strategy of trying to cut back and hope that it would spur economic growth, this notion of supply side economics. So Kansas under Sam Brownback, and it was discussed um, in the case study, cut the top personal income tax rate in 2012, and it reduced revenue, but it also income tax as a share of state revenues fell rather significantly. The other side of the equation is in Minnesota, where they raised income taxes mostly to focus on secondary and K-12 and post-secondary education. They raised their rate, became the third highest top marginal income rate for the highest earners. Middle income rates were modestly increased, and you had a 1.4 billion budget surplus in fiscal 18-19. And here's what happened to their employment, to their economies. And so this is a blow to what the Bush the senior called voodoo economics, because it really is voodoo economics. It's a sheep in wolf's clothing to give rich people a tax cut, in my estimation. Um, so, what should guide tax policy? Most of the evidence, and this is a really good source, I thought about including it. You could look it up. The Benzie, Black, and Dowd study, investment in K-12, higher education, and infrastructure are the only policy decisions at the state level which have a statistically meaningful correlation to economic outcomes. High investing states had the largest increase in worker wages at the same time period. So it is an investment worth making for your economy to invest in K-12 and post-secondary education. The multiplier effect for these tax cuts, across the board tax cuts, The multiplier basically, anything below one drains out of the economy, anything above a one adds to the economy. And so you see the tax cuts across the board, cut the income rate, accelerated depreciation, and spending on items such as education, public safety, health and human services, infrastructure. Those spending increases add to the multiplier effect. So the cuts drain the economy, actually increasing spending in some of those areas add to the economy. So very definitely an item for debate and an important issue, and that's moving the dime on the most important funding source that we have in education.